All right, welcome back. I am excited to get back at it. It has been since August since I've done one of these. I'm really happy to be doing one of these again. I enjoy doing these, and I hope I can keep doing it after this. But I just had something on my mind pretty heavy that I wanted to share. I think it's a little bit of a fresh perspective on a very serious problem that our society has, and um, my the main topic of today's discussion is how our society views a number of sins and how our society encourages those sins. But then there's this one sin that our society, I think, still has a healthy perspective on. There's a healthy condemnation of this sort of behavior. And so my argument is going to be, look, we need to look at these other sins that we encourage similar to how we look at this one sin, right? We need to start discouraging these sins, and we need to have a healthier perspective on these sins that we encourage. We need to stop encouraging them. And of course, when I say we, I'm just talking about the culture more broadly. And then after that, we got some cool cultural stuff. That's always the most fun stuff to get into. We're going to get into the Batman. The Batman movie came out, what was it? Maybe about a month and a half ago. Awesome movie. Want to talk about that. And then Donda, the album, if you could remember back to like October. So that's what I do. I like to do a podcast and then I disappear for like a year and then I talk about things that happened like 6 months ago. That's what we do here at the Resurgency podcast. But no, we're gonna go over Donda. I think it's a great album. We're gonna go over probably one of the worst movies I've ever seen in my life. It's absolutely atrocious. And then what else? Oh yeah, briefly touch on a man digging a hole and how awesome it is. But that cultural stuff, if the podcast goes too long, we might save all that for a separate one. Might chop it up into two pieces. But before we get into it, a few life updates I want to address. First and most notably, as you might notice, that I have cut my hair since the last time we have been, or since the last time I did one of these. So that was fun. Needed to go back to the short hair. I enjoy it. Very low maintenance, which is cool. Since the last time I did a podcast, I wrote a senior thesis on Christian missionaries to the Kansas Territory before it became a state during the period known as Bleeding Kansas. Perhaps I will do a podcast in the future kind of giving an overview of all of my findings and of my argument. That would be really cool. It was a great study. And a couple exciting things. I graduated from Berkeley, got a bachelor's degree in history. Pretty cool. And what else? Oh, yeah, I moved out to Tennessee. Tennessee has been great. Tennessee is a fantastic state, and it's so awesome. You can go into a pawn shop, purchase a firearm, be out the door within like 20 minutes, and then go to the neighboring mom and pop gas station, and you might find the best barbecue you've ever had in your life. Like, that's just so American, and the government is off your back. California loved to have a nanny state government with everything, all these laws. Tennessee is like, you just kind of do whatever you want. You're an American, and that's really how it should be. I gotta say, it is kind of weird being around a lot of people who are kind of like-minded, right? Like, this is a very conservative state. We love that, and it's also, you know, very Christian state, especially compared to California, right? Especially like when I was in Berkeley, my nonconformist, go against the grain, contrarian personality that I love to tout. It was pegged at 10. I loved being at Berkeley because everyone was liberal and I was secular, and I was like, I'm this Christian conservative. I will die on these hills. Not really. I kind of kept my head down because I didn't want to get expelled from the school. No, but it's kind of cool to be out here. It's different. It's my craving to be the contrarian, nonconformist. It's hungry, but I think I have found one thing that I could really go against the grain on when it comes to being out here in Tennessee and in the South. And here it is. Are you ready for this? The folks out here refer to highways without a "the" in front of the number. So in California, you would say, hey, let's hop on the 5 and go up to the Bay Area. Or, hey, let's hop on the 15 and go up to Vegas, or something like that, right? Here, people don't say that. So for instance, where I'm at, the two highways that are a pretty big deal are the 64 and the 65 and the 24. And you'll hear people who are from the South call it 65 or 24. Oh yeah, 24 gets congested. And this is something, or hey, 65 is a pretty fast route. This is something that just bugs me because I love to nitpick, right? The is an article, and an article provides specificity. So people say, yeah, 24 is rough. It's like, oh man, yeah, I guess that age is a really tough time. You're fully into adulthood by then, or man, 65 always gets congested. It's like, oh, are you more prone to colds or no, you got to put the in front of it to specify, right? It's the 65, okay? The 24. This is a hill I will die on, okay? People say don't bring your California out to Tennessee. I will absolutely do that in this case. I will die on this hill. I believe it is a crucial topic, a crucial issue in our country. Put the in front of the highway number. All right, people. Now, I've probably just made everyone east of the Mississippi just incredibly mad at me, but that's all right. Remember, I love being a nonconformist. I love being a contrarian. All right? I thrive in this. Okay. All right. In all seriousness, let's get to the topic at hand. We are talking about the way that our society views different kinds of sins, the way that our society encourages a number of sins, and then the way that our society has a correct and healthy view and condemnation of one particular sin. So something I should say at the outset is, because my argument is something that needs to be drawn out, and it's something that I want to be very clear on, this message that I'm going to be sharing is something that could make a lot of people angry and upset. So I don't mind that I make them angry and upset. It's that I want to make sure I'm saying it in the most accurate way possible, the way that or the most clear way, and so as to not be taken too far out of context, and also in a way that is the most loving and charitable. Because I'll tell you right now, if I'm just winging it and going off the cuff, which I usually like to do, I will say something that I probably shouldn't have said, and it will just add fuel to the already large fire that this message could create. Okay, so my apologies if it sounds a little too scripted. The folks watching this on YouTube may not get all the animated aspects of me that you typically get. All right, so how's that for a 9-minute introduction? Welcome to all of you who just skipped through all of that. I totally understand. All right, here we go. Let's get a sip of water, and let's get to it. All right. Proverbs 25:28 says, "A man without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls." I ask why the author chose to compare such a man to a city broken into and left defenseless. I think it's because self-control regulates what comes into your life and what comes out. If presented with an opportunity to do something and you choose not to do it, then you have prohibited that thing from entering your life, right? Pretty basic. But why the picture of a pillaged city and no defenses for the one with no self-control? Without self-control, you are then only governed by desire. Being governed by desire can invite all sorts of things into your life, good and bad. And the bad is what pillages the city. And desire is not an inherently bad thing. The issue is that desire can be easily guided by emotions. Pure desire paired with emotional thinking can end in catastrophe. We might call this acting on impulse. In essence, without a rational mind to patiently think out the best way to satisfy a desire and deal with an emotion, we are basically animals. Let me give you an example. One of my dogs, Phoebe, she is a Cocker Spaniel. She has zero self control when presented with the opportunity to get a treat, right? She will jump as high as she can, scratch as high as she can, run as fast as she can, and be as mean to any other dog as she needs to be to get her treat. If she feels another one of the dogs has gotten in the way of her receiving a treat, I have seen her go after them and bite them. Not just to scare them off, but it's almost like a nasty revenge she exacts on them. It definitely crosses the line. Her desire for that treat, having no self control because she's a dog, turns her into a monster. And she'll go after the we have two dogs that double or maybe triple her size, but her desire for these treats, no fear. She will go after them and wreck them if she needs to. But let me give you more examples of my dogs, because who doesn't want to hear more stories about my dogs, right? So one time, I gave Phoebe a treat, and her insatiable desire to eat it ended up hurting her. She tried to chew it so fast that she got it lodged in a rather precarious spot in the back of her jaw and nearly down her throat. She freaked out so badly that it began to cut her mouth, and I could see blood in her mouth. I had to grab her pretty firmly so I could put my hand in her throat and yank it out. Had she a little bit of self-control, she would have chewed the treat properly and been fine. Instead, she got a cut-up mouth because of her insatiable desire that she could not control. By the way, she was fine afterwards, all good. Or let's do another story. Take a recent addition to the dog pack from my home. We got a puppy. We also have a very old dog. So I used to just call my dogs in to feed them, and as the old dog would slowly get through the door, my puppy would come running around the corner so fast running so fast through the doorway, he would knock down the old dog. He tried to fit two dogs in a one dog space, right? It just doesn't work. And the old dog, weak hips, it was a chore just to get her off the ground. You felt so bad for her when he did it, and it was a whole thing to pick her up. But he just did it because he lacked self-control. And this is what happens when you give in to insatiable desires. The point is, when we lack self-control, we hurt ourselves and we hurt other people. Without self-control, we are governed only by our passions, which makes us indistinguishable from the rest of the animal world. I bring up my dogs because they are an extreme example. If you take acting on impulse to its logical, most extreme conclusion, which human beings are capable of, you start to mirror these examples that I laid out about my dogs. Let's see. But what happens when we live in a culture that glorifies these passions, these desires, and diminishes the value of self-control? Well, you get the society we live in today. Let's think of it in terms of the 7 deadly sins, right? We have pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, and sloth. Now, I've heard people call it sloth. I don't know. I'm just going to call it sloth, and I apologize to the sloth community. But morally bad behavior can be attributed to at least one, if not a combination, of these 7 deadly sins, or what have been called vices. My dog Phoebe was so overcome with greed that she'd attack other dogs if she felt the treat that was hers was being threatened to be taken from her. My puppy was so overcome with gluttony, you might say, that he harmed our old dog so he could satisfy that passionate desire to eat. Now, this should go without saying, but I have to say it anyways. My dogs didn't actually sin because they are animals. There's no ability for them to exercise self-control. If we were to behave like that, we would be sinning because we have the ability to exercise self-control. I just use dogs as examples, right? Extreme examples. Okay. Now, I want to show you how our society encourages a few of these vices. Then I want to talk about one vice that I think our society still exercises a healthy discouragement of. My goal is to show that how we view this particular vice should shed light on how we ought to view these other vices. Now, let's start with some sins or vices that our society encourages. Excuse me. All right, so let's go first with gluttony. Now, gluttony is defined as the excessive indulgence in food and drink. In recent years, we have seen an increase in what is called, quote, fat acceptance. Morbidly obese people are having their lifestyles celebrated, right? Magazine covers, celebrated in articles, the whole schmear. To openly stand against it is to open oneself up to attack. In recent memory, look at the singer Adele. Adele lost a lot of weight, and then the pro-obesity or fat acceptance crowd scorned her for it. She had to do interviews apologizing and clarifying her motivations so as to make sure she wasn't condemning an obese lifestyle. I remember seeing her interview with Oprah. She said something to the effect of, "Do what makes you happy. Losing weight wasn't something I needed to do to be healthy." I think she even said something like, I just started working out with the intention to lose, she said something like, I just started working out without the intention to lose weight because working out just happened to be what made me happy at the time. Oh, just happened to be it, right? Or perhaps Lizzo, pop singer, I don't know if she's a songwriter, but pop singer, and yeah, here we go. She is one of the most outspoken celebrators of obesity. One time, she said she was going on a detox diet. Before she could blink, she had to apologize to the angry mob and clarify she wasn't wanting to lose weight. She claimed she only did it because her eating habits were giving her heartburn and stomach aches all the time. Who would have thought an obese lifestyle, especially one of her stature, also coincides with heartburn, stomach aches, and all of that? Interesting coincidence. Fat activists, yes, that's what they call themselves, have even gone so far as to attack mainstream medicine that advocates against an obese lifestyle. We know obese people had a far higher chance of dying with COVID. Where was the mainstream science on encouraging exercise and better diets? Needless to say, if you want to feed your passion of eating terribly and not exercising, you will be met with applause. If you criticize it, expect personal attacks. Now, let's pivot to the sin of lust. Lust is perhaps the most pervasive sin in our culture. Well, maybe aside from pride, which is the sin that begets all sin, but we'll get to pride in a second. It's hard to know where to begin in pointing out how lust-filled our culture is. But we'll give a few examples. But first, lust can be described as placing sexual pleasure as paramount, even at the expense of others. Well, first and most prominently is how pornified our society is. Bringing up a few studies here, according to an Indiana University study, the average age of exposure to pornography is 11 years old, with 9 in 10 American boys being exposed to porn before age 18. And I have some links below if you want to check out my sources on that. I don't have the time to discuss the harmful effects of being exposed to pornography at an early age, but suffice it to say that the damages are devastating and can manifest in so many different harmful ways. To learn more about the harmful effects of porn, I'd recommend listening to the work done by Matt Fradd. I have a couple talks that he's given in the link below, or in the description below. There are links to his talks, and then from there, I would highly encourage you to check out his resources on helping it if you struggle with porn addiction or know someone who does. But to move on here, another example of lust is hookup culture propagated by dating apps. My biggest gripe with dating apps like Tinder and what is it? It's like, is it Bumble? I think it's called Bumble. One of my biggest gripes is that no matter how much people try to claim otherwise, the apps place physical appearance as the most important. right? It's very clear, especially when you consider how fast and how easily you can just swipe. It's just you look at their physical appearance, swipe, swipe left, swipe right, based off that. These means of finding romantic and sexual interest have turned people, frankly, into objects. So let's go with another example. Open marriages. Open marriages are increasing in mainstream culture, especially in news and articles and celebrities. Think of Will Smith. They talk openly about open marriages, and they want to see the culture shift to that. So, lastly, on lust has to be the Pride movement. Originally, the Pride movement began as gay pride. Now, when you see what is being celebrated at these gay pride parades, a lot of it is sexually degenerate behavior. Pretty much all of it is sexually degenerate behavior. But especially now, they're trying to normalize kinks, fetishes like this torture stuff, and all sorts of other things. And these people are advocating for children to go watch these parades when this degenerate behavior is being openly out in the streets and all of that. It is quite a terrible sight to behold. And this is not to mention the biggest aspect of Pride, which is openly encouraging homosexual lifestyles. Now, this is an openly Christian podcast, and if we're going to take our faith seriously, we have to point out that homosexual behavior is sinful. Nevertheless, whether it's homosexual practices, infidelity of the form of open marriages, or fornication, that is the hookup culture that is becoming more and more popular, sexual degeneracy is not only on full display in our culture, but encouraged. Now, of the last of the seven deadly sins that I want to mention is pride. We're going to really focus on three here today. So, pride is the sin that begets all other sins, right? Where gluttony was placing food and drink above self and others, and lust was placing sexual pleasure above self and others, pride is placing the self as supreme. The self is placed over others, and most importantly, over God. I could leave it at that because, like I said, pride is involved in all other sins. You're putting yourself first at the expense of others, whether it be your sexual desires, desire for wealth and success, and so on. But I do want to give a couple examples that show what pride being encouraged looks like in our culture. First, look at how our society views divorce. It seems every few months there is a story of a celebrity couple who is getting a divorce, and one of them says, I just need to do what's best for me, right? The media champions people who do what's best for them. But in reality, the children of these couples are the real victims of the divorces. Divorce can have a number of negative impacts on children, and I'll have more to say on divorce later. One more potent example of the sin of pride in our culture falls within the pride movement itself, right? Who would have saw that coming? Who would have seen that coming? And that is the acceptance of transgender ideology. It used to be a man liked to dress up as a woman and vice versa, right? We call this cross-dressing. I think, what was it, like transvestites, or, even like more masculine women, a tomboy, right? That was something that it happened, but now our society is saying that men who appear as women actually are women, or who identify as women actually are women. This is pride at its best. This movement is saying you have to indulge a distortion of reality, a delusion, because they say so. It's a person who says, I'm putting myself over reality, and you have to affirm that. Pride at its basic level. If you deny trans women are women, then you're labeled a bigot, a transphobe, you're canceled, and who knows what else might happen to you. So there are some... Okay, so to wrap that little section up, there are some brief examples of how gluttony, lust, and pride are celebrated. Now, there are a few other sins that are certainly rampant in our culture and encouraged in some cases. but perhaps aren't so openly encouraged like pride, lust, and gluttony. I think those three are really at the forefront. Sloth or sloth isn't championed as much, although there is an anti-work movement and younger people aren't motivated enough to do much. Sloth has been called the sin of, quote, don't care. I do think it's interesting that the content and the volume of it on the internet has a desensitizing effect. The internet can and usually will desensitize a person to pornography, violence, hatred, and more, really instilling that culture of don't care. And then there's envy, which is very real in our culture. St. Thomas Aquinas says, with much qualification and explanation, that envy is the hatred of a good enjoyed by one another's neighbor, or the rejoicing in his harm. I do see envy when it comes to views of the rich. I don't have time to get into it, but a lot of hatred towards rich people, once you kind of peel back the layers of it, is simply because these haters don't have the wealth they're critical of, right? A lot of nuance and discussion to be had there, but perhaps for another time. And then greed, there's greed, defined as the disordered love of riches. It's actually far more pervasive, I think, than lust and gluttony. I can't really get into it because it's basically the air we breathe. But here's what I'll say. Look, it's everywhere, and the best way to tell, the quickest way to tell, is to just look at how materialistic, like, Christmas and Easter have come. Like, look at the original messages of those holidays, and then look at how our society celebrates them. There's a big gap there, and I think greed is a primary motivator in that gap. All right, so that is 6 of the 7 deadly sins, and that brings us to wrath. Wrath is something like wishing and carrying out undue harm on someone. Anger or hatred isn't necessarily sinful. See, if you love something, then you will hate anything that threatens it. By and large, our culture doesn't really condone wrath, and we can use this example to demonstrate the absurd position our society takes on the other vices. You might think our culture encourages wrath given the riots of 2020 and 2021. Nothing like that CNN reporter calling calling a riot a mostly peaceful protest as the building behind him was burning down. But something to consider is a lot of what was hijacked by people who just use the riots as an excuse to loot, right? Not a lot of wrath there. It's more just people exercising their destructive tendencies. Perhaps greed more than wrath, although of course, wrath was definitely present. But to whatever extent wrath was in the hearts of those rioters, I think it's safe to say that mainstream culture doesn't encourage it in the same way that it does things like pride, lust, gluttony, and so on. See, those sins are encouraged to be fed on the individual level, to incorporate them into your daily life and even proclaim it publicly. But what would it look like for our culture to encourage wrath? It would mean phrases like, be the bigger person, or don't fight fire with fire. They wouldn't be popular. If something or someone was bugging you, the culture would say it's a good thing to snap and lash out. One could imagine this hypothetical culture would teach its children that wrath comes in all forms. Some don't express it like others. It's good to accept the anger that you feel when something bugs you, or when something goes wrong, and then act on it. If the desires that wrath produces in your heart drive you to manifest them physically, i.e. punch someone in the face, then you're just being your true self. Regular expression of wrath would be encouraged. Perhaps communities would be formed where people would want to meet up to let their rage out. Next thing you know, Fight Club isn't underground. If you spoke out against it, then you'd be deemed rage-phobic, or perhaps a rageist. Sorry. I'm kind of proud of that hypothetical name. All right. Those who encourage wrath would say that you're repressing people's natural expressions of themselves. But our culture doesn't encourage this. Though I'm scared I just gave a roadmap to encourage it. But why don't we encourage wrath? Well, we understand that feelings of rage are, quote, natural in a sense, in a certain sense, but we understand that natural doesn't necessarily mean good. Perhaps rage and wrath is a part of our nature, but it's more a part of our fallen nature. We understand that if you act on wrathful impulses, people can get hurt. You can hurt people and you can hurt yourself. What's more is if you were to make this a large part of your individual identity, you would become an incredibly lonely person. You would drive people away, scare them off. You would also experience an inner death. Knowing you had full license and approval to lash out at someone, you would dehumanize them. You'd always have in the back of your mind, if they do something I don't like, I can be violent towards them. Thus, intense selfishness would ensue. If they don't do what you like, then it all comes back to how you feel and how you want to respond. Thankfully, our culture recognizes the awfulness of wrath. We teach our kids to use their words, to take a deep breath and calm down. And there's a form of punishment they receive if they act on this impulse. In other words, we recognize that restraining these impulses is a good thing. There are boundaries we have to put in place so that we don't fall victim to our wrath, and more importantly, so other people don't fall victim to our wrath. So, is wrath just a unique vice? Absolutely not. What would it look like to treat other vices like how we treat wrath? All right, let's take gluttony, for example. Instead of having fat pride and fat acceptance, we would say that a gluttonous lifestyle will kill you. We would encourage healthy eating and exercising, and I'm old enough to remember, like, I don't know, maybe a few years ago, where that actually seemed to be the case. With gluttony, you will physically destroy yourself, and take it to its logical conclusion. You will hurt other people. A friend and I watched a couple episodes of the show My 600-Pound Life. I don't recommend it, by the way. But something I noticed was that these lifestyles are tough on the people around these morbidly obese individuals. They require family members, friends, and caretakers I've seen to literally operate small cranes to get them off the couch or out of bed. They need people to drive them places. The medical and financial issues they face also bear down on their family because most of these people don't have jobs to pay for their issues. And if you're even more keen on these people, you'll also see that they're incredibly selfish. Why? Because they see this impulse that comes, quote, natural to them as supreme. If someone gets in the way of that, they do what it takes to move them out of the way. Or lust. Let's look at lust. What would it look like to discourage lust? And forgive me, but I'm going to go on about this for a few minutes. We would tell people first and foremost that their sexuality is not their whole identity. They are much more than that. We would not condone or accept fornication or homosexual behavior. Each and every one of us experiences sexual impulses and feelings. And that's a good thing, but it's how we feed it that needs to be addressed. Why is fornication, or just aka sleeping around, and homosexual behavior wrong? Well, one, because God said so. But further, because it encourages the objectification and dehumanization of the other person. When you're sleeping around, you only see the other person for their physical qualities, yet there's so much more. They have been reduced to a chunk of meat that you can use for your own selfish, fleshly pleasure. The sexual act is not just physical, but it's emotional and spiritual. It's evident that sex is so special when we see what abusing it looks like. If sex was just a purely physical act, then what would separate rape from physical assault? Nothing. But we recognize how special and deep it is, so the two are distinct, as they should be. However, when you are sleeping around, you are reducing it to just a physical act. And in doing so, you are damaging yourself and the other person, again, emotionally and spiritually. If any one of these three aspects of sex are not honored, then each person will be hurt in the aspects that were neglected. And the spiritual component is something that our society absolutely misses. This is where I say that fornication is also sex outside of marriage. Marriage is supposed to be offering the relationship to God and embarking on a lifelong commitment. When sex is honored in that commitment to God and to each other, then that's when the act is at its fulfillest. Or, oh my goodness, sorry, I misspoke. Let me re-say that. When sex is honored in that commitment to God and to each other, then that's when the act is at its fullest. There we go. This is why married Christians, hate to break it to you, have the best sex. I'm just saying. All right, you can check out the article and the notes that goes over this study that says religious married couples are more satisfied in their relationships. Look, I'm just looking out for you. I want what's best for you. So if you need another reason to become religious, to become a Christian, here's another. I'm glad I can help. I'm just saying. All right, here for you. All right. And I already mentioned it, so I might as well explain where I'm coming from. Why is homosexual behavior wrong? Notice I say behavior, because we all have sexual impulses that, if acted on improperly, are sinful. And because they are sinful, they are hurtful to ourselves and to other people, right? I can't spend too much time on it, but you have to ask, what is sex for? Well, in its fullest form, it bonds two people physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And, surprise, it produces more people. Who would have thought? So intentionally curbing the fullest form of sex goes against how God designed it. So it follows that homosexual behavior is an intentional act of going against the fullness of what sex is designed for. There is something to be said against indulging in sexual activity that does not have the capability of producing children. It's somehow hateful to ask why the gay revolution in the 80s happened at the same time of the AIDS epidemic. I'm not saying it's the gay disease. Clearly, AIDS was rampant in heterosexual people as well. But the point is, when there was a sexual revolution, that is, an encouragement of a lustful lifestyle, we see harmful results coincide. Of course, I would apply that same logic to messages that encourage the same lustful behavior in heterosexual practices. If you want to press me on that, then go ahead, but I do need to move on. So to wrap it up on lust, putting restraints on our sexual impulses can actually result in sex experience in the most fulfilled manifestation of it. Now, to touch on what it would look like to discourage pride in our culture, which, full disclosure, I recognize has never been possible in history because man is inherently prideful, but let's just go with this hypothetical for a moment. Let's see here. When I previously mentioned pride, I brought up our current view of divorce. If we had a healthy look at pride, we would treat divorce differently. We'd encourage lifelong commitment in marriage. We would explain the beauty of such a commitment. We would encourage people to look for potential spouses based on shared beliefs and shared life goals, instead of how a lot of people do it, where their feelings are the primary driver in the relationship and convictions and goals are secondary. We would encourage forgiveness, patience, and understanding for both the man and woman. The community surrounding the couple would come together and encourage both to sacrifice, to forgive, to be patient, and to put the legitimate effort into saving the marriage. I also brought up transgenderism for pride. These people who have legitimate mental health issues are being encouraged to mutilate themselves and to try to become something they're not. There's no legitimate evidence showing that the mental health of these people improve after changing, quote unquote, their genitalia. If we look at this from a healthy perspective on pride, we would try to understand why these people feel uncomfortable in their bodies. There must be something deeper going on, or else we would see improvements in mental health after, quote unquote, transitioning, right? We would tell these people that they are beautiful, how they were made. They are not this other person they think they are. We would emphasize that God loves them very much, and He meant to make them in the body they are in. To bring it back to my original point, taking into account that addressing each person's struggle with a certain vice is a very serious thing that requires a lot of thought, care, patience, and love. My suggestions barely scratched the surface, but my hope is that they signified the proper view of these vices. I'm not saying anything new. No, I'm just echoing Christians throughout the centuries, and we are all taught by principles laid out clearly in the Bible. So, I ask a question, why not treat these vices this way? We already treat the sin of wrath this way. To those who disagree with me, I pose this question to you. What makes these vices different from wrath? Why should we not view these other vices like how we view wrath? Now, of all the things I've mentioned, I understand that I've probably pissed just about everyone off at this point. But I have to ask those who are upset by my words, if you have considered that it's possible, I might be right. If you think I'm wrong, then explain why. I want to hear it. Let's engage. Why should people not give into the impulse of wrath, but be allowed to give into other impulses that indulge pride, lust, gluttony, greed, right, and so on? I certainly don't see any evidence that it's doing any good. In fact, I would encourage those who disagree with me to listen to the stories of people who have overcome these temptations. There are people who have worked really hard to get through rough patches in their marriages and came out the other side feeling a stronger connection. We all love to see stories of people who work out and eat right and go through weight loss transformations. Or there are people who have given their homosexual attractions up to God. Also, people who have given up their lifestyle of sleeping around. Some of the most moving stories are people who bought into the transgender lie but then came to see reality. They turned to God and accepted how He made them. I have met some of these people, and they are truly admirable and frankly inspirational. And when you listen to these people, they don't sound like people who have been repressed or victims of hate. In fact, something you will pick up on is a genuine sense of peace and joy. And they might even say they feel free. Why? Because they have experienced true freedom and not the false freedom our culture espouses. Jesus said, "Everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin." When you let your impulses dictate your actions and character, you are not in control. If one acts according to his impulses, then there's nothing that separates him from animals. The one who is in control of his impulses, however, is the one who experiences true freedom. The key is to intentionally restrain oneself from negatively acting on those impulses. The folks I just mentioned, the ones who overcame the impulses that our culture encourages, the ones who overcome the sins, the vices that our culture encourages, they introduced boundaries in their lives to keep from feeding those temptations. They listened to the people who told them no and told them that they needed to change. They themselves said no to certain things and perhaps placed certain guardrails to keep them from indulging those temptations. It required taking responsibility, having accountability, and extreme discipline, and they're all the better for it. And they would attest to that. Some of you may have heard of Jocko Willink, right? He has a famous phrase, discipline equals freedom. I highly encourage you to listen to how he explains it because there's a lot of overlap between where he's coming from and where I'm coming from. Christians who have seriously embarked on overcoming sinful habits know exactly what Jocko is saying and know it works. Something that separates his message from the Christian message, however, is that Christianity emphasizes God's role in the process. In order to truly overcome sin, you must see it for what it is. Ask for forgiveness because sin is wrongs done to yourself, others, and most importantly to God. And then after you come to realize that, receive God's grace. Plus, you need something far higher than yourself to look towards in the journey, especially because you will fail. When life gets tough, you will be tempted to revert back to your sinful ways. Yet once you understand that your journey is not one that is done alone, rather God is there for you to help you, and He forgives you. He's there for you when you fail so that you can get back up and get back to it. And that's what's truly empowering. God's grace is an empowering gift that nothing can do for yourself. Excuse me, I misspoke. God's grace is an empowering gift that nothing you can do for yourself can ever give you. And one last thing I'd like to say, I agree and I have experienced all of these things that I've just been sharing with you. But something I'd also like to add is taking on these responsibilities, these restraints and accountabilities to overcome sin, to overcome these vices that we can be trapped to, that we can be enslaved to. Once you have taken on that responsibility and actually experienced real triumph over these things, and you do experience that freedom, something else that you get aside from the peace and joy and happiness and freedom is confidence and the disposition to become depressed. I think so many people are plagued with a lack of confidence and are prone to becoming depressed. And let me just say that if you need more reasons for overcoming these vices, these temptations, other than peace, joy, happiness, fulfillment, triumph, freedom, which are huge, throw in there confidence and a higher aversion to depression. And that is all I have to say on that. I hope this has caused you to think a little differently. Why do we treat wrath in a correct view, where we do put restraints on it, but we don't do that for the other sins. In fact, we encourage them. And my hope is that perhaps maybe one of you is hearing of all of these sins, and instead of leaning into what our culture would have you think, that all of these responsibilities and messages that I've been sharing with you are somehow repressive, and that acting on your impulses is really what makes you free. Maybe you have really indulged those impulses, and there is something deep down within you that recognizes that you are living in hell, and that you are miserable, and that you have become enslaved to these things. And as good as the culture says these things are, they're actually awful, and they're not satisfying you. And if that's you, I just so earnestly encourage you to seek after Jesus, to seek after the freedom that he can give you, and recognize what these sins are. Recognize that those sins are first and foremost against God, and recognize that Jesus took the punishment for those sins so you don't have to, as the greatest act of forgiveness, the greatest act of grace, and let that grace free you. It is one of the most powerful things you can experience, and it's something that I will personally attest to every single day, and it's something that I will not shut up about ever, because I have experienced the true miracles of this freedom, and I have seen people overcome far worse than I have, and they have experienced the true freedom, and they will attest to the miracle that it is in their life. And I really want what's best for you, and I want love and joy and peace and beauty and freedom and confidence to enter into your life. And I hope that these words that I've shared with you would invite you to embark upon that life. It's hard, but let me tell you, is there freedom, is there triumph at the end of it. And of course, if you have any questions about this, I really encourage you to reach out to me. You can comment. Even if you don't have a question that you want me to answer, maybe you disagree, you're more than welcome to comment on this, and I'll go through it, and perhaps I'll address it in the next podcast. But if you have questions, or maybe you want to talk more personally, I recognize that most of my audience actually knows me personally, so you probably have the means of reaching out to me personally. So feel free to reach out to me. I'm always open, and I really thank you for listening if you've made it this far. As far as the cultural stuff, like going over Batman and Donda and all that I mentioned at the top of the podcast, we're looking at 49, almost 50 minutes, so I think that's a good place to stop. Look forward to the next podcast where we kick back and we just talk about these cultural things, not as much of a heavy episode. All right, thank you once again for listening. I hope you have a great day, a blessed day, and I'll see you in the next one. All right, take care.